So welcome everybody to this research seminar at the Institute for Future Study. I'm very happy to have Kimberly Nicholas here, who's going to talk about From Population to a Child, Personalizing Future Generations and Climate Change. Kimberly is now a senior lecturer at Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies and did her PhD in Stanford. She has moved all the way from Stanford to Lund. Not that, that's very good. And currently you're running a research group working on sustainable land use in Lund. But you also written this paper, which you're going to talk about today, about what kind of actions, individual actions, are the ones that have the most impact on climate change. We're very much looking forward to hear about that. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gustav. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for joining this morning. I'm very glad to be here. So I just did a Google image search for population to have some sort of generic background, and this is what came up. So it's kind of this faceless crowd, this idea of the mass of humanity. And what I'm talking about today is personalizing that down to individuals and our choices. And to humanize that a little bit, I have an image of a child that I met at COP21, the Paris UN Climate Summit in 2015. So this was a young girl who had traveled there with her mom. She was not allowed in the negotiations because there was an age limit, but she had created a paper doll which was there to symbolically represent her and her friends and those of her generation who were watching and hoping that the world's leaders would take action to combat climate change. So there are a lot of young people who are very well aware of the problem and are very passionate and motivated and inspiring in addressing it, and also present a real urgency for personalizing this issue. This is a roadmap of where we'll go today on our journey together, with the background of two friends of mine and their young child who were traveling by bike through the Alps, so kind of a roadmap of a happy low-carbon future. So I'll start with some context and we'll go from there. Just as a point of background or departure, what is the problem of climate change? If we go back to 1992, the UN and the world's governments recognized this as a potential existential threat to humanity, and that it was necessary to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So this has been the goal ever since, and here I've highlighted the goal in managing climate change or mitigating climate change, preventing climate change, is that stabilizing greenhouse gases so that we avoid dangerous climate change. And this should allow ecosystems to adapt naturally. We should ensure food production is not threatened, and economic can be proceeding in a sustainable manner. So basically this means, believe it or not, people made the recognition that it's important to have conditions on Earth where humans can grow food, nature can survive, and all people have the opportunity for a good life. So that's pretty fundamental. Of course, the details of how to do that have been long negotiated. In 2015, there were some major steps forward. So the global goals, or the UN Sustainable Development Goals, lay out in 17 goals and about 160 something, I think, targets and indicators what this looks like. But basically, it's a recognition that everyone on Earth should have an opportunity for a good life that has access to health and education, to opportunity, and to live on a living planet that can support these human activities as well as nature now and into the future. Specifically for climate change, a few months after the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, which I mentioned already in Paris in December 2015, this limit was set that humans will aim to hold the increase in temperature well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit to 1.5. So this is kind of this red line, this line in the sand that's been understood to be dangerous, and that the risks above this level are increasingly serious and things that we very much want to avoid to be able to pursue a good life on Earth. So what does this mean? If we look at where we stand today, we've already, previous generations, and all of us here today as well, have already emitted a lot of carbon. And this means that we've used up a lot of the safe operating space of the atmosphere. So accelerating in recent decades, emissions have increased to the point where now a recent presentation from Glenn Peters at the Swedish Parliament, I think this was last week, maps out what's the remaining carbon budget, and to stay below 2 degrees or 1.5 to avoid dangerous climate change. There are different ways of calculating this. It depends on assumptions and ways of measuring how much is already warmed and how much can be allocated in the future, but very consistently, it's clear that to avoid dangerous warming, emissions need to go to zero rapidly in the next few decades, and potentially to be below zero after that. So if we're not going to take carbon out of the atmosphere in the future, we need to stop emitting it close to immediately, something like 10% declines per year. If we count on removing carbon from the atmosphere later, that does buy us a bit more time. Of course, there's concerns about how feasible is that, what would that look like, how fair or how desirable is that. But the message is really clear. To avoid dangerous climate change, we have to stop emitting greenhouse gases. So what are our options to do that? Well, there are 4 levers that contribute to human emissions of greenhouse gases that are driving climate change. And here you see it in the yellow line. Oh, I'm told not to point. I'll use the pointer. This dark yellow line here is fossil energy emissions, so greenhouse gas emissions, most of which come from burning fossil fuels. And you see that those are very tightly correlated with 2 factors, which are population, the black line, and GDP per capita, so affluence, basically a measure of consumption. So those 2 have been strongly increasing in the last decades, and those are the main drivers that we've seen for increasing greenhouse gas emissions, driving climate change. There are 2 trends that are working in our favor that are reducing emission, but you see that they're not nearly as strong as the other 2 that are increasing. So those are basically technological improvements and economic efficiency. So either using clean energy that doesn't produce carbon to produce what we want, or, excuse me, sorry. So either using clean energy or making energy more efficient. And both of those trends have been improving over time, but not nearly as much as the others. So previously, getting down to the context of the study, there have been some analyses of global scale, often national or sectoral policies, either potentially that could be implemented in the future, so calculating forward. This was from Project Drawdown, what would have the biggest impact on reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. And these are things like silvopasture and reduced food waste and onshore wind turbines. So some of these are things that individuals might play a role in, but often they're at quite a large and abstract scale. I will point out, given the topic today, that number 6 and 7 here together are the only 2 in this women and girls category, but they added together end up being the largest potential for reducing future emissions. There was an analysis by The Economist a few years ago that looked at historically what has worked to date to reduce emissions, which policies and measures have actually avoided emissions. And what we see is that the Montreal Protocol, which was designed to protect the ozone layer, has actually had a co-benefit of a lot of climate protection. Clean energy or carbon-free energy, including hydropower and nuclear power, and growing renewables, which has increased a lot since this came out a few years ago, those have prevented a lot of carbon emissions. The only, I think, population-related measure that they looked at here was China's one-child policy, which did save emissions, of course, was a humanitarian tragedy and has not been something desirable that, it's not a policy that democracies advocate or should pursue. So there hasn't been a lot of focus on, most of the focus has been on these technological improvements. If we look now at where do the emissions come from geographically, we see that about half of the carbon that's in the atmosphere, so half of the budget that's already been spent, that's not available for us anymore, comes from North America and Europe. About 14% comes from India and China, and the rest comes from about 150 countries. So those are the main players in terms of having used up the carbon capacity of the atmosphere. If we break it down by income, now this starts to get more interesting. So some work a few years ago shows that the richest 10% of global population, so that I'm fairly certain includes all of us in this room because it includes about half of people in countries like Germany and the US and certainly in Sweden as well. We collectively produce almost half of household emissions. So these are emissions from transport, from energy use, and from food consumption, and direct consumption as well. So there's a big imbalance with lifestyle that leads to a big difference in emission levels. The Swedish Environmental Protection Agency has recognized this. They say very clearly on their website, if you account for consumption-based emissions, the emissions that we demand here in Sweden, about a third of them are from public consumption. So that's things like building roads and public buildings and so on. 2/3 is from household or personal decisions that fall under our individual realm. So that's food, living, so that would be heating and energy, and transport, mostly flying and driving. And a small fraction from direct consumption of things like clothing and shoes. So they say really clearly, in order to meet the long-term goals, Sweden has the climate law now in place and has established that we will be a net zero emissions country no later than 2045. We have some ambitious targets on the way there, like reducing transport emissions 70% in the next 12 years. To do this is going to depend on behavior change and some lifestyle changes. And the challenge that I see is maintaining a really good quality of life while dramatically reducing emissions on the order of from about 11 tons today to 1 to 2 in the future. That's the level they say here. Some peer-reviewed literature has said 2.1. But strong agreement that to meet the climate target, to avoid more than 2 degrees of warming, we need to cut emissions that are, for example, in Sweden today by 5 to 10 times. So a really big reduction, about half a reduction in the next 10 years. So there's the context. Let's get on to the motivation for our study. So teaching in a sustainability program, I have about 40 master's students a year who come from all over the world. Excuse me. One of them was Seth Wines, who came to us from Canada. He graduated in 2015, and he has a background as a high school science teacher. And this turned out to be really influential in driving his thesis work. What I show here is the parallel universe of the thesis that did not get written, because Seth's original idea in working with me was to study the gray jay, which is a very beautiful bird that lives in Canada. It's very friendly, as he said, and a sign of good luck in Cree culture. He had a story about a student of his who had a gray jay land on the window the day that he was born, and this influenced him to be a hunter because it's believed to be a lucky sign. So Seth was really interested in the gray jay and thought about pursuing this for his thesis, but funding and other logistics did not work out. So he came to me and said, okay, I'm really worried. I don't know what I'm going to do for my thesis. I need to do something that I can do desk-based research here in Sweden. I said, don't worry. You are a brilliant student and a very clear thinker, and I'm sure we'll figure something out. So that's where Seth's second idea came from, which was to focus on high school education, given his background and experience with high school students who had asked him, what is it that I personally can do about climate change? The students were very well aware of the problem and wanted to know what really was within their realm of possibility or power to make some change for. So that's the motivation behind these questions from high school students, from others that both Seth and I have repeatedly gotten from people who want to know what it is that their choices, which choices of theirs actually make the biggest difference. That led to Seth's thesis, which we have a second paper in review now, which is about the curriculum design and process of education in Canadian high school science textbooks. But I'll focus today on the part we've already published and that you've read, which is both analyzing the high impact actions and looking at how they're communicated. So that leads me to the design of our study. It was a study of studies. So we didn't conduct original research to compile these numbers. These were results that are built on the hard work of a lot of other people who have done many specific individual studies over many years. We took only, in the main text, we do have in the supplement all the studies we could find for all of the actions. But in the main text, we focused only on industrialized countries. And that's because, as I mentioned, we have so much higher emissions, and we have such large reductions needed to get to the sustainable per capita level of 1 to 2 tons that I mentioned. So we wanted to say for individuals in those countries who have the opportunity and the potential to do so, what choices really make a difference. We used a life cycle analysis approach, so we accounted for the whole production, use, disposal, or recycling, and so on of a product, for example, or a car. I'll show more about that on the next slide. We converted everything to carbon dioxide equivalents, so all the gases were apples to apples, so we could compare. This ended up being 39 sources, mostly and primarily peer-reviewed, but some carbon calculators and gray literature where we could find it. And 148 scenarios. But our criteria was this had to represent current status of the situation on the ground, so a no policy situation. And that's because we wanted to inform people's choices today. We put everything on a per person, per year basis, so assuming that an individual has the ability to make this decision themselves, and For example, correcting for the average vehicle occupancy if a car, for a car, so that it averages out to how much one person's impact is. And again, these are choices that are within the power of an individual to make. And we frame them as the maximum possible effect. So a lot of previous studies, which I'll talk a bit more about, talked about ways to drive more effectively or to switch to cleaner cars. But we talked about living car-free as the maximum possible choice. We also looked at existing recommendations from 2 authoritative sources. So these would be places that people like us, high school science students, or friends and colleagues of mine who had asked about, where can I go for this information might look. So that included high school science textbooks. We analyzed 10 of those, representing about 80% of the student population in Canada, and government recommendations to citizens in English-speaking countries or regions. So that was the US, Australia, the EU, and Canada. Excuse me. This is just an illustration of what I mean by life cycle analysis. So for an example, in the case of a car, it takes into account manufacturing, fuel refining, and transport. You see, for a car, the vast majority of emissions come from actually burning the fuel, so that gas mileage or fuel use really matters for climate impact of a car. And then maintenance or disposal or other. And we found many studies that evaluate cars. So for example, there were 13 studies that analyzed the typical gasoline car, what's the life cycle emissions of that in different countries and situations. We found 9 that evaluate hybrids. We only found 1 study that evaluated the carbon legacy. So this was a way of calculating, taking this life cycle thinking and applying it to the choice of having a child. So the way this worked, it's a study by 2 statisticians in Oregon, so Murtaugh and Schlacks. And they define the carbon legacy as responsibility for carbon emissions of their descendants weighted by relatedness. So if this is a person who's alive today making a decision about having children, if they had 2 children, they would be responsible for half of their children's emissions, and their partner, who's not shown here, would be responsible for the other half. They would be responsible for a quarter of their grandchildren, and so on. So that's how the calculations work. And if you take, they ran a bunch of simulations to say, what would this look like under current scenarios and several future assumptions? So what if someone has, a small lineage that dies out quickly, and their children don't go on to produce more children, or they don't have children, versus what if someone has many children who then themselves go on to have many children? So this is a page taken from their paper, and it shows some of the assumptions. To get into the real details, we can maybe save for the questions, but I'm happy to go through. So, of course, to calculate this in the future, you have to make assumptions about fertility rates, population growth, emissions levels. So how much emissions does it cost to live in, for example, Bangladesh versus the United States, or what's the average level of emissions there? And those are enormously different, about 160 times different. So taking all this into account and looking at different future trajectories of, a non-mitigation scenario, sort of business as usual, or what they call the optimistic scenario, where mitigation is put into effect and emissions do go to 0, this makes a huge difference for future emissions. So this was the first figure that we had in the paper, and this showed the averages of all the studies that we found that met our criteria. And you can see that we divided them into low, medium, and high impact choices. So this was something we felt was really important, because what we'd seen previously was often a list that presented a lot of different options without really giving a sense of how important they were. So if you're someone who looks for advice on what can I do about reducing my carbon footprint or emissions, you might be told to upgrade your light bulb or to live without a car. And there's an enormous difference between those two that wasn't very clearly communicated. So we tried to focus on these high impact actions that were consistently high impact in reducing emissions across a range of scenarios that we studied in these developed countries. So the 4 that we settled on that were consistently high impact were eating a plant-based diet, living car-free, avoiding flying. Here's it's shown for 1 transatlantic flight. So that's the only number on here that's not annualized, because it depends how many flights you take per year. For anyone who's flying, this number is probably the largest single choice in a household. And of course, having 1 fewer child. So that number turned out to be much bigger than all of the rest. We did have a 5th sort of candidate here, which was buying clean energy, buying green energy. We didn't include it in the top 4 because there was one study that showed that some of the system designs in Great Britain, for example, meant that there weren't additional emissions reductions. So while it is often a very high impact action, for example, you can see here in the USA, Canada, Australia, it does reduce a lot of emissions. We left that out of the messaging just to make sure everything was clear. If we look at the government recommendations, so here are the 4 sources, Australia, Canada, US, and EU, and here's a list of the possible actions that they recommend. And then we link with how much carbon is possible to save from taking those actions. The yellow actions are the high impact ones that I highlighted previously, and you see a lot of blank spaces here. So no government said anything about family planning or eating a plant-based diet. 2 did mention avoiding flying, and 1 mentioned living car-free. But you see that it was much more common to mention, for example, recycling or home heating and cooling efficiency, and other measures that have a much smaller impact. Recycling, for example, saves about 4 times less greenhouse gas emissions than a year of plant-based diet. And you can eat 2 years worth of meat or fly from here to New York and back. So that's something you can emit in a day as opposed to a year. So recycling, for example, and some of these other choices are not the biggest impact actions. Similarly, we found with the high school science textbooks that very few of them mention the high impact actions. So out of 216 total mentions, so in these 10 textbooks, how many specific actions were mentioned? Only 4% of them were of these 4 high impact actions. And here we show the number of textbooks that show them. So 2 textbooks talked about avoiding air travel, and 5 actually talked about living car-free. But the other 2, plant-based diet and family planning, were not mentioned at all. And it was much more popular, again, to mention conserving energy, things like turning off the light when you leave the room, or recycling. Okay, so those were our results in the paper. Then I'll talk about how we tried to get this message out to the world. So I was extremely lucky and really grateful that I had the opportunity to go to something called the Vega Fellows training, which was a week of science communication, week-long workshop in Finland, hosted by Compass Communication. So Nancy Barron is the head of that. She's developed this message box that's available online as well. And she's written the book called Escape from the Ivory Tower, which has a lot of great advice on science doing just that and communicating their results. So here I show 3 of, I think, about a dozen message boxes that I worked on, from much messier and like trying to get the message straight to getting down to how we wanted to frame this, not getting into all the details that academics are usually interested in of what are the assumptions and methodologies, because that's not usually what the public wants to know or needs to know as a headline message of what did this study do and what did we find. So here the takeaway was the science basically tells us the possibility of a good life on Earth depends on reducing climate pollution dramatically. Here I said about 90% over the next 30 years, cutting in half every 10 years, different ways of framing that. But the problem, as we saw it, is that many individuals recognize the importance of climate change and are motivated. They want to do something about it, but they don't know what they should do. What of their limited time and effort will really make an impact? And we found that governments and schools aren't focusing on actions that really make this difference. So the so what, along with governments, schools, organizations, local communities, other communal or collective actions, individuals, we believe, can play a really important role in climate change. And we found these 4 high-impact actions that consistently made a difference. If they were understood and communicated and people could act on them in making their personal decisions, there would be benefits where people were supporting this transition to a fossil-free society to avoid dangerous climate change, showing that it's possible, the potential for ripple-up effects. From example, we've seen this in travel policies and in conferencing, where vegetarian food is becoming the norm, for example. There are also many co-benefits, which I'll talk a bit more about. So focusing our time and energy on the choices that really matter. That was our message. Seth and I worked really hard to try and get this message out in a lot of different ways. We were helped by a huge group of people, communicators and experts from Lund University who supported us, both graphic design and outreach, many of the people from this Vega Fellows who were instrumental. So we had a lot of support. Seth made a 3-minute video abstract, so another way to get the message out. It's available on the journal website. He used his background as a science teacher to create some education materials, which we also have available. All these are available on our website. We did an Ask Me Anything on Reddit, which was really interesting and helped frame a lot of very interesting questions. So we were available for public interaction. We made an FAQ that goes into more of the details and methods and references and sources, and also helped save us time when overwhelmed by media interest, that we could kind of refer them there or have a clear party line on how we explain things. And then I wrote this personal reflection, which I sent around, some of you might have read, of sort of how I personally have taken these choices into account in my own life. In terms of visual communication, this was another thing we worked really hard on. Seth and I have been in touch about developing this talk, and he said, this is like summer 2015, it's taking me back, like trying all these different ways of trying to represent these actions, and different color codings and 1 dot per study. And you see here at one point we had dog ownership included, and then it wasn't a clear enough result. And then another study came out after we published this that could be included in the future. So it was an evolving process. Here we tried to be really transparent about, okay, here's all the sources, here's exactly where you can find everything. But in the end, we found it was pretty unreadable. So we settled on this version for the paper, where the height of the bar is the average of all the studies we included, and the notches here are specific countries per study. And then in the supplement, which is a part of the paper, and we published it open access, so it's available, we list all of the studies, and there's a footnote for exactly where the number came from. So there is this traceability, but it wasn't the front line we communicated. Importantly, we worked with a professional graphic designer who helped us translate this bar graph that we made in Excel to something that was much prettier and easier to digest and more meaningful, I think. And we made some changes here, like switching the order, because we realized people read from left to right, and we sort of wanted to go from low, moderate, and high. In hindsight, I might have wished to, something a master's student from Australia wrote me and suggested we should have done, which I think was a good idea, would be to make this bar a different color and make it clear that those emissions are counted in a different way. So when we talk about, for example, aiming for under 2 tons per person per year as a sustainable level, that's consumption-based household emissions. That's not accounting for this choice of having a child. And we need to find ways. We tried really hard to communicate that. And we do have this asterisk here, but people didn't always pick it up. This is just a funny exchange that Seth and I had. So, we were responding to media, which I'll show you some of the responses that we got. It was a very overwhelming time. And here was a communication that I had with my colleague Numi, who's our communications officer, who was helping me set up interviews. And basically what she's saying is, okay, can you do this in 5 minutes, or can we make this interview work at 5? You have one interview for US National Public Radio, and then Sveriges Radio wants to interview as well. How about we get you a cab and take you to Malmo so you can do both? I was like, I can't take a car to the interview. I can't publish this research saying live car free, which I do, and then rely on a car to communicate this message. We have to make this work in a different way. And she's sort of like, no, you can't. Okay, well, make Skype work. And Seth and I shared this with Seth, and he said, yeah, I spent 3 hours on public transit yesterday commuting and making my CBC interview work. So just to show that we still find ourselves embedded and living, of course, in this fossil fuel-based world, which is the current world we live in, whilst trying to imagine a different future. Okay, part of the communications, I mentioned this already, that we mentioned in our press release, and it's in the paper. News media didn't seem to find it very interesting, so they didn't pick up on it very much. But we did talk about the health benefits, for example, of plant-based diet or of active transport. Car-free living also decreases airborne pollutants, so not just for climate benefits, but for other benefits as well. And these were quantified, but this wasn't the most successful communication opportunity, I would say. Okay, so what was the uptake, or what did we see in the media? So from this kind of one source, or one hopefully consistent message that we tried to get out, how was it taken up and interpreted? So IFL Science, their headline was pretty close to our press release. These 4 lifestyle changes will do more to combat climate change than anything else. And after some sort of context, they sort of get straight into the, these things that people are involved with in their everyday lives have the biggest impact. Science Magazine, a little bit more ominous. There's these smokestacks in the background. The best way to reduce your carbon footprint is one the government isn't telling you about. But then they do also report all 4 actions and talk about that. Now we get into the babies. So I really cringed when I saw this headline and this picture. But this was the story that The Guardian ran. And I think the story is well written and fair. But this sparked a big reaction, I think, which I'll show you in a minute. So, want to fight climate change, have fewer children. Next best action, selling your car, avoiding flights, and going vegetarian, according to study into true impacts of different green lifestyle choices. Okay, so now we start getting the National Review, which is a conservative US magazine, the problem with the science behind having fewer children for the planet's sake. So now this is a critique where the author says, I have no scientific credentials of any kind. Nevertheless, I can discern through armchair reflection alone that these scholars are quite wrong. And then getting into, do you really want my attention, climate scientists? Commission a study on the climate impact of a liberal environmentalist suicide pact. So this went to some pretty dark places. One lesson that I learned is it's not a good idea to read these things while you're trying to focus on your message, and it's not, the comments sections of internet newspapers are not a happy place to spend time. In case you don't know that, now you do. Here was one of the most critical, environmentalists openly blaming people with, quote, too many children for climate change. This quote, too many children, doesn't appear anywhere in the article because it's, of course, not something that we said. But this was their conclusion, that the left is constantly engaged in a culture of death, which is why they push abortion and euthanasia, national health care, so governments can decide who lives and dies, and complete control over your life. The war on your fertility has long been waged. Now the left is more open about it. So there were all kinds of political goals and aspirations ascribed to these numbers. And then finally, a personal one. So Rush Limbaugh, do people here know who he is? In the US, he's one of the highest paid, apparently, entertainers in the US, and he's a well-known radio talk show host, so he has a large following, including my parents. So Rush Limbaugh has often been on in the background of my childhood growing up. So what this story is the first part is an interview I did with National Public Radio, which is like Sveriges Radio in the US. So the host, Steve Inskeep, is asking me, can I ask you a personal question? Do you have kids? And I say, I don't. It's something I'm thinking about and discussing with my fiance. And he says, oh, congratulations. It's wonderful you're getting married. I say, yes, thank you. It is wonderful. And, he's a wonderful guy, and we're really excited. And, this is a really personal decision, and we both really care about climate change. So this is one factor we're considering. Of course, it's not the only one. So then Rush Limbaugh's comment is, can you imagine, this woman is probably engaged to some pajama boy that might have not won the audition for one of Obama's TV ads on sustainability. She's engaged. She's trying to decide whether to have children because of climate change. She's deciding. Why even get married? What's her name here? Kimberly, why get married? What is the point if you're not going to have kids? So, weighing in on my life decisions. So thanks for the tip, Rush. I have considered it, and we'll take it into advice. Then we go on, further results. So this is Torbjörn von Schentz. He's the president, the rector of Lund University, who published on his blog about a month after I think we published the article, something that said, he had been getting requests to censure or take off the website or disavow or silence research, and used our article as an example. And he said very clearly that this is, very appropriate to have public debate on scientific results, and that's as it should be, that this should be taken up politically and ethically and economically, but he would absolutely not censor research, and academic freedom is just that, free. And this is very important in society, to have researchers have freedom to ask and answer questions and report them honestly. So I really appreciated this response, and I've thanked him for it. But I didn't know anything about this until a journalist called me and asked to interview me about this response. So then I found out that there had been a campaign that had been sending him emails asking him to do this. So it was an interesting summer. I'll move on now to the narratives and kind of close with some reflection. So before we take discussion. I guess this article, if you read the article, we don't spend a lot of time talking about the decision to have a child. We recognize that it's one of the choices. It fits our criteria. It's important information for people to have, but we don't go into the ethics or the thoughts about it. And I guess, this one study that we rely on that goes forward into the future and tries to attribute or calculate and then attribute responsibility for future generations, it made me think also about my past history and how far back on my family tree can I actually go? How many of my ancestors do I know personally? And the tree doesn't go very far back. This is one that I found online that's very complete, but you know, it's quite crazy to imagine that a lot of the carbon that's in the atmosphere now was emitted by relatives of mine and by all of our previous generations who probably weren't thinking about us or couldn't imagine what our lives would be like now, and that we're alive today and making this choice that makes a huge impact for the future of our planet, for the future of humanity, including people who are alive today. And it's just so hard to wrap your head around that and sort of really envision who those people are and what they might want or how they think. But we who are alive today are having a much bigger impact than previous generations have, and I think have a much bigger responsibility to face that impact. I really like this graph from Sophie Lewis, who's an Australian climate scientist. She posted on Twitter in her framing, why does the Paris Agreement matter? She's trying to humanize climate change and say, you know, here's her lifetime. So here's when her mom was born, when she was born, her daughter is born, and then imagining when her daughter will graduate from high school and potentially have a child who will you know, be alive for this time where the world could look really, really, really different. And you know, here's the low emission scenario where we succeed at maintaining warming below 2 degrees. Here's what you know can be called the business as usual or the pre-policy scenario where we don't. And I think it keeps me up at night to imagine a +4 degree world. I think that's a world that's not compatible with a good life for almost anyone on Earth and for most species as well. So this really drives that point home, that this choice that we make today, these lifestyle choices and larger political and social choices that we make really shape the future for ourselves and for the people who come after us. In looking at how young people are represented in the context of climate change, I've just pulled out a few different narratives as part of a larger project I'm working on. One was at the People's Climate March, which I attended in 2014 in Copenhagen. There was an 8-year-old girl who said that she dreamed of studying the ocean but was afraid the oceans may be dead when she grows up. And this is not uncommon. I hear this from kids when I talk to them. I'm giving a talk to high school students this week, and I have recently. Kids are incredibly aware of the risks, and I think rightfully really scared about them. So this can be one framing of the vulnerability of youth, the lost options or opportunities for young people growing up under the threat of climate change. This is taken up sometimes scientifically as well. This paper by Jim Hansen and colleagues, obviously the title makes very clear, young people's burden. So making the point that delay in climate mitigation is abdicating responsibility for emissions and forcing this problem off to future generations. And that should sound very familiar because that is largely what's been done until now. So we find ourselves in this position where previous generations did not maybe consider our best interests. And it's really a time of reckoning of, are we going to do the same? Or are we going to actually turn this tide and do something different? I thought this was a really smart reflection from Kaisa, who's a colleague from Lund University. She was also a delegate to the Swedish, a delegate from Sweden to the UN, to the COP most recently in Bonn. And she says here in Swedish, and I'll just read Google Translate or in the English part, but at a climate conference she went to in December saying, I'm amazed, or November, amazed at how many people are raising children as a problem and not the solution to switch to a climate-friendly behavior during the climate forum. I bet the world would be much more sustainable if we listened to more children and young people. So pointing out that it's not fair to problematize and abstract children and young people, that the people who are here now have a right to a good life and basically many ideas that are worth listening to. I see this narrative here, some of our students who won a climate hackathon a few months ago in Lund for their idea, and it's part of the Climate Kick initiative. So often there's this hope for youth as innovators and people who have fresh ideas, and I strongly believe in this and am inspired by getting to work with and teach young people. I would just caution that I think it's not fair to expect them to solve the problem themselves or to place that expectation on them of like kind of give up, like, oh, well, we failed at this, hopefully the next generation will do better, because we know that the clock is really ticking in terms of having a chance of staying within our carbon budget and avoiding dangerous climate change. I think youth are well aware of the climate issue. As I mentioned, a recent survey here in Sweden showed that for young people ages 18 to 29, the climate was the biggest issue that they care about for the upcoming election in September. But nonetheless, they didn't expect it to be taken up by politicians. So I think this is a really important issue. Back to the COP, to the UN international negotiations, here was a ambassador to the UN who's saying that he's counting on youth to influence decisions in their countries, so explicitly inviting or empowering young people to become involved politically. And some people are very much doing that. Here's a young woman in the US who's part of this youth versus government lawsuit, which has been going forward in saying that the government is failing to protect their rights by allowing unchecked climate change. And a quote from her, just because we're too young to vote doesn't mean we don't have a political voice. And certainly what we see happening in the US with youth movements now, here's one regarding a movement called 0 Hour. So she's a 16-year-old climate activist who is organizing a march that's going to take place, does she say here? I don't want to give the wrong date now, so I won't say it, but she said, climate change is not a problem of our generation's making, but apparently it's now up to us to do the work that should have been done decades ago. So I see a lot of youth really stepping forward and seizing the reins. In thinking about having a child, this is something I want to close on. So one woman I found really inspiring was Kaya Chatterjee, who I heard give a talk a few years ago. And she talked about her and her partner deciding to have a child and wanting to pursue that and realizing that it would tend to lead towards their emissions increasing and committing to reducing their overall household emissions even with having a child. So she talks about the personal choices that she has made to sort of account for her whole household consumption and make it what she calls a zero footprint baby. And she's also written a book about that. I haven't read the book, but I think this idea is really inspiring. And I've heard actually from many parents who say that they are inspired by their children to reduce their own emissions. One of the most powerful things I've read recently was this story from a few months ago in the Espressen. And it's by a journalist there who takes his children on a flight and describes going snorkeling or diving at a coral reef that has died. And his 11-year-old says, oh, it looks so beautiful in the movies with all the colors, but that's just in the movies. So, and he knows from having gone snorkeling himself as a boy that that's not just in the movies, that this is something that isn't natural or normal, and it's not a fantasy that there were beautiful, or there still are some beautiful living coral reefs, but this is something happening here and now. And the title, I'm tired of showing my children a dying world, and he talks about flying around and taking selfies with a dying world in the background. So I think this was really a wake-up call. It sparked a lot of important conversations. I see this changing the political tone in Sweden with politicians pledging not to fly before the election. This Jag stannar på marken movement is also taking off, no pun intended, staying on the ground. But I think these kind of conversations started to come up about, well, what actually is the point? Like, what are we trying to achieve? What does it mean to have a good life, and how can that be compatible with a safe climate? And I think the eyes of the world are really on Sweden in many ways to be a leader there, because we have the climate law, we have what is often cited as lacking of political will and opportunity to do much better. So I guess those are kind of my closing reflections, that climate change is a clear and present threat, and looking at the impacts through the lens of children, I think, can be really illuminating in saying, okay, why is the impact of having a child so big? It's because we consume so much. Is that really necessary? What of that is really improving our quality of life? How could we imagine things being different or better so that it is possible to continue to have a good life on Earth that's not just for the few or increasingly threatened, but available to everybody who is here now and who will be in the future? So I think with that, I would like to close and thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.